Morning. I will be reading from Leviticus 19, the entire chapter. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, 'Be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Each of you must respect your mother and father. You must observe my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make metal gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. When you sacrifice a fellowship offering to the Lord, sacrifice it in such a way that it will be accepted on your behalf. It shall be eaten on the day you sacrifice it or on the next day. Anything left over until the third day must be burnt up. If any of it is eaten on the third day, it is impure and will not be accepted. Whoever eats it will be held responsible because they have desecrated what is holy to the Lord. They must be cut off from the people. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not deceive one another. Do not swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not defraud or rob your neighbour. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favouritism to the great, but judge your neighbour fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbour's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbour frankly, so you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord. Keep my decrees. Do not mate different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with two different kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. If a man sleeps with a female slave who is promised to another man but who has not been ransomed or given her freedom, there must be due punishment. Yet they are not to be put to death because she has not been freed. The man, however, must bring a ram to the entrance of the tent of meeting for the guilt offering to the Lord. With the ram of the guilt offering, the priest is to make atonement for him before the Lord for the sin he has committed, and his sin will be forgiven. When you enter the land and plant any kind of fruit tree, regard its fruit as forbidden. For 3 years you are to consider it forbidden. It must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all its fruit will be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year you may eat its fruit. In this way your harvest will be increased. I am the Lord your God. Do not eat any meat with the blood still in it. Do not practice divination or seek omens. Do not cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourself. I am the Lord. Do not degrade your daughter by making her a prostitute, or the land will turn to prostitution and be filled with wickedness. Observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. Stand up in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God. I am the Lord. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or quantity. Use honest scales and honest weights, an honest ephah and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Keep all my decrees and all my laws and follow them. I am the Lord. Amen.
Thanks, Tori. Now, earlier this week, I asked on Twitter 4 questions to try and gauge people's opinions. So here on the screens, you'll see those 4 questions that I asked. First of all, is it okay for a Christian to engage in fortune-telling or witchcraft? Is it okay for a Christian to shave the side of their head? Is it okay for a Christian to get a tattoo? Is it okay for a Christian to pimp their daughter as a prostitute? I wonder what answer you would give to each of those questions. The reason for asking those 4 questions in particular is because all 4 of them come up very closely together in part of the passage that we've just read out. So if you have got your Bibles open, you'll see it there in chapter 19, which was read out in verse 26. Halfway through verse 26, it says, "Do not practice divination or seek omens." That's witchcraft and fortune-telling, as one translation puts it. "Do not cut the hair at the side of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. Do not degrade your daughter by making her a prostitute, or the land will turn to prostitution and be filled with wickedness." Now, I'm sure you're very keen to see the results of those polls that I put out on Twitter. Now, bear in mind, this is Twitter, and anything goes on Twitter. You never know who's going to answer, and there are over 100 answers for each of the questions. Some people deliberately give the wrong answer, for example. So the results are up there. So for witchcraft, the bars have gone a bit funny in transferring the files over, so they don't quite add up, but that doesn't matter. You've got the percentages there anyway. So for witchcraft, 2% say it's okay. It's 2 people. 98% say it's wrong. And 0% say are undecided on that one. So I think that's pretty clear-cut that we go along with the command that's there in Leviticus. But for head shaving, it's much more mixed than I thought it would be. I thought it would be 100% saying, yes, it's fine, shave the side of your head. But there's a few maybes there, aren't there? But nevertheless, the vast majority are saying that it's okay to ignore this law in Leviticus. And then for tattoos, again, that is much more mixed. Now, this might be representative of the kind of age range that are on Twitter, maybe, just as a suggestion. But the majority, again, are saying, yes, it's okay to ignore this law in Scripture and have a tattoo. And then a quarter of them are undecided, or maybes, and 11% are saying no. What about for prostitution? Well, the one person who said yes actually contacted me and said they were joking because they knew everyone would be clicking no. So everyone thinks that this law in the Bible still stands today, that Christians should not pimp their daughters for prostitution. So this one, as you would expect, everyone is saying that this should still be upheld. But how is it that we can decide that for at least 2 of those we can pretty much ignore them, but for the other 2 we have to stand by the law that's given in the Bible? Why do we say that Christians cannot go to a fortune-telling evening, and yet we don't put someone under church discipline when they go and get a tattoo? Why are we saying that? Is it just that we can pick and choose which laws we think we can carry on agreeing with, and which laws we just say, you can change that one or do that with this one? Can we just do away with the laws that society has changed its mind on? I mean, I imagine for many of you, when you grew up, tattoos would have been seen as the things of sailors and only sailors, and no one else would get them. Whereas today, pretty much every young person has a tattoo. Do we just change the laws of the Bible along with the whims of society? Same-sex marriage, for example, has been on the cards in the Anglican Church, and they've moved towards, at least towards blessing same-sex marriage. And of course, the church in Wales has already moved to that position quite a while ago. Now, for some systems of teaching, trying to get your head around this, some systems of teaching for Christians have understood the law in 3 different categories, and maybe you've heard of this. That some people think, well, the law is 3 different kinds of laws. There is the moral law, the civil law, and the ceremonial law. So the moral law is what's just right and wrong. The ceremonial law was to do with the worship of the community of Israel, and the civil law was to do with them as a society. And so most people who would divide it up into these three categories would say that the civil and the ceremonial, the society and the system of worship, we can do away with that because that's fulfilled in Jesus. But the moral law, that still stands. It's all very neat and tidy. But there's one big problem with that I see. The Bible doesn't do that itself. The Bible isn't divided into these are the moral laws, these are the civil laws, these are the ceremonial laws. So let me explain how I would come to understand the decisions on what is done away with and what continues to apply. With the coming of Jesus, he said himself that he fulfilled the law. But he didn't abolish the law. So he's both fulfilled the law and abolished the law. So that means, he's fulfilled the law but not abolished the law. Let's make sure we get that right. That means, I think, that the Old Testament law in its entirety has been fulfilled in its direct application beyond Jesus. So with Jesus coming, it no longer, in its entirety, directly applies to us. And that means, I would say, that the Old Testament law has no immediate bearing upon us. Now, before you throw me out as a heretic or something, there is a big but to that. The big but is that every single law has some ongoing purpose and application for us as Christians today. So although there is no direct application on the entire of the Old Testament law, there is a purpose and application. There are principles that we carry through today. Now, what that means is that when we're reading the Old Testament law, what we need to do is to think about what is the core principle that is in this law. What is the purpose of this law as it was applied to Israel back then? And what is the purpose that can then carry through its fulfillment in Jesus and therefore its ongoing application to us today? And the easiest way you can do this is if the New Testament itself reapplies one of the Old Testament commands for us today, because it does the hard work for us. Let me take one obvious example of this: the Sabbath. Now, I wouldn't use the word Sabbath to refer to the Sunday, to refer to our day of rest. I would talk about Sabbath as resting. But the Sabbath no longer directly applies to us as Christians. And we know that's true because, at least for the vast majority of Christians, they don't take their day of rest and worship as Saturday. Because that's what Sabbath was in the Old Testament. It was Saturday. So we all say that something has changed in the application of that law from the Old Testament to today. But the core principles of Sabbath, they carry over. Why was the Sabbath given? Well, it was given to encourage us to stop working at least one day a week, to stop completely working, and to worship God alongside his people, so to gather with his people in worship. They are the two purposes of the Sabbath: rest from work, worship of God with his people. And those two core principles can still be carried through today. They still apply to us today. It is good for us to rest from our work one day a week, and we still need to worship God together as his people. And Sundays is a great opportunity to do that because it marks the rest that Jesus has secured for us in his resurrection, which was on the first day of the week, the Sunday, which is why for most churches around the world, they gather on Sundays as his people to rest from work and to worship God as his people together. So the direct application has been fulfilled. The direct application of Sabbath no longer has immediate bearing upon us as his people in the light of what Jesus has done. But the core principle of that law continues through to us today. Now, the caveat is that sometimes Christians are going to disagree over what the principles are. Sometimes. With some of the less obvious ones, with some of the ones that aren't repeated in the New Testament, the principles, there might be disagreement over what exactly they are. And that will require humility and grace. But for other ones, like the ones we're going to talk about today, they will be pretty clear-cut. Now, before we really get into it, there's one more thing that you need to be absolutely clear on, and this is the most important thing in how you understand this part of Leviticus, and that is how all of this flows out of the status that we have already been given. The passages that we've looked at, that hopefully you've read during the week that's just gone, it constantly reiterates that God has already made us holy. Now, the diagram that is on the little cards that will be on the screen now, that diagram is really helpful in understanding this that we're talking about. Picture it as a bit like a mountaintop. The top of the mountain is where you get the best view, isn't it? If you've ever climbed a mountain, I'm sure most of us have, or at the very least, a little hill. Then you know that when you get to the top of the mountain, you get the best view. It's the best place to be at the top of the mountain. And going up the mountain is how you get to that view. Now, going up the mountain with us, with the book of Leviticus, it's all about how we approach God. How do we approach God? And for that, we need an organized scheme of sacrifice. We need a priest. We need a system of purity so that we can come near to God. And God gave the people these things as a gift of his grace so that they could approach God. So it was out of his grace that they were able to approach God. But then you also needed one more thing, and that was a day on which full atonement would be made, when there would be a full and definitive declaration of God that his people were made right with himself. When a sacrifice for sin was made for the whole people of God so that they could all be declared holy. And for the Israelites, this had to be repeated year after year after year because it wasn't the main thing, it was just a picture of the main thing. But the main thing is Jesus. The main thing is that on one day, he gave his life on the cross sacrificially for us. He fully atones for the sins of all who trust in him. He has fully atoned not just for our sin, but for all who trust in him from all of history past and all of history future as long as it continues, and for all who trust in him from all across the world. One day on which complete atonement is made, and that is what the top of the mountain represents, the Day of Atonement. So that is the pinnacle. Chapter 16 that we looked at last week, that is the mountaintop view, that Jesus has died to make us one with God, and in doing so, he makes us holy. But now we're coming down the mountain in Leviticus. And that means that everything that we're looking at now is in response to this. So here's where we are in Leviticus 17 to 20, just starting to come down the mountain. So that means for this week and the next 2 weeks that follow, all of this is not about how we come towards God, but how we live in response to what God has done for us. So all of these rules that we're looking at, and this was the case for Israel as well, for all of these rules, they're not how can I be good enough for God to accept me, but they are God has accepted me by the Day of Atonement, and therefore this is how I'm going to live because of what he has done for me. This is how can I enjoy God? How can I experience him in my life? How can I give my life over in service to him? How can I follow him? So let's get stuck in to how we then begin to enjoy God by staying holy. How can we stay holy? Well, first of all, be holy in relation to God. Now, a good portion of all of these laws are about how we are to worship God. And the people of God were supposed to be holy or distinct from the people around them in how they worship God. Because the rest of the nations, they all worshipped idols. They all worshipped false gods, images of God that were not the true God. Whereas God's people were to worship the true God in the way that he had set for them to worship him. So in chapter 17, that meant only doing sacrifice in the tabernacle. so that they wouldn't be drawn into local idol worship, which would have been more likely if they could have done sacrifice wherever they wanted, because there was no one there to regulate it. The 4 laws that we began with, the 4 questions that I put on Twitter, they are each one of them to do with idol worship in one way or another. So witchcraft and fortune telling, it's connecting with the spirit world, which is engaging with beings that are not God as if they were God, which is a type of idol worship. Offering a daughter for prostitution, that probably was linked with the pagan nations and their practices, because that's what they often did in their worship. And so you can well assume that the reason given for not shaving the side of your head and clipping the edges of your beard was probably also connected with idol worship. And likewise, marking your body with tattoos was probably connected with idolatry of the nations around them. Now remember how we explained that we carry through the principle even though the direct law no longer applies. Well, the principle is that we are still today to avoid idolatry. We're still to only worship God in the way that he has given for us to worship him. And idolatry would be breaking that principle. So in light of that, we are still to avoid witchcraft and fortune telling, because they are still forms of idolatry. They are giving to another being, even a spiritual being, that which ought to be to belong to God alone. And so we can say quite bluntly that witchcraft and fortune telling are wrong. But shaving the side of your head no longer has any obvious link with idolatry. You know, we can talk about the idolatry of image, that's a different matter. But to put an outright ban on shaving the side of your head, well, there's no reason to say that is indicative of idolatry. And so by all means, carry on shaving the side of your head if you want to. Tattooing, that can be a form of idolatry. Many people do tattooing for idolatrous reasons, but it's not inherently idolatrous. So that's down to your conscience, really. Now, as for sending your daughter into prostitution, well, that's not linked with idolatry today. On the basis of this verse alone, you couldn't say that this verse still carries through to us. However, there are many other reasons given in the Bible why that application is wrong. There are many reasons in the Bible why giving your daughter over to prostitution would be a wrong thing to do. And part of that we're going to look at today. Now imagine one of your relatives was having a special birthday and you were part of maybe a spouse, or maybe it's one of your parents or brothers or sisters, whatever it is, and you're the one who's organizing it all. You're the one who's making their birthday the special occasion it's going to be. And your special relative comes to you and says, I don't want a fuss, I don't want a big party, just want a nice little meal with my closest family and friends. And they said to you as well, look, I've got so many gadgets, I don't need any more gadgets, just get me a gift voucher, for something like a spa day, that'll do me fine. That's what I want. But then you went and threw them a big party. You thought you knew better about what they wanted for their birthday than they did. And what's more, you got them just another gadget that they do not need or want. Now, how's your relative going to feel if you're celebrating their birthday in the exact ways that they said not to? Wouldn't be good, would it? You wouldn't be loving towards them if you did that. You wouldn't be enjoying them for who they are. Now put God in the shoes of the special relative. How we worship him ought to be in the ways that he has told us to worship him. If we do not worship him in the ways that he has told us to, it is not loving towards him. It is not enjoying him for who he is. We are to be holy in relation to God in our worship. Second thing we're going to look at is how we're to be holy in relation to the family. Now, there are 2 chapters. You can't avoid them. They are largely about sexual relationships. One is, the first one of those, chapter 18, is talking about what's right and wrong in sexual relationships for the most part. And then chapter 20 is more focused on what do you do when someone does the wrong thing? How is the society supposed to respond to that when the laws have been broken? Now, the laws spend a lot of time prohibiting sex with close family members. And we're probably inclined to agree with that prohibition carrying on today. Nevertheless, it warrants being said. The Bible here prohibits sexual relations not only with close family members, but also with someone else's spouse, with an animal, with someone of the same sex as yourself, and several other things as well. Now remember, these laws no longer directly apply to us, but the principle does. So what is the underlying principle within all of these laws about sexual relations? Well, I think we can take it right back to the very beginning of the Bible, to the beginning of sexual relationships in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 2, when God made the man and then made the woman and the man to be together. He gave them the gift of sex within the marriage relationship. And it was very clear from the beginning that the marriage relationship was the only context for sex to take place. One man, one woman, in lifelong union till one of them dies, exclusively so, and everything else is prohibited. Which means that although these laws from Leviticus don't directly carry over to us today, we can certainly say that the underlying principle does. The underlying principle has ongoing application to us today. Now that's made clear in the New Testament. God's word, through the words of Jesus and through the words of Paul, both of them go back to the Genesis 2 principle. Both of them go back to when God first gave sex within the context of marriage. And both affirmed within that as well, both Jesus and Paul, both affirmed the high calling of singleness and celibacy. In fact, you could argue from the Bible that Paul particularly and Jesus are almost saying that to be single is better. So for Christians today who want to enjoy God's gifts in the right context and thereby to enjoy God, well, our sexual relationships must be holy. They must only be kept within the lifelong marriage of a man and a woman, exclusively. And then as single people to be faithful in celibacy. So that's one aspect of the family relationship. The other aspect of family relationships in these chapters is that of honouring parents. So chapter 19 verse 3 reiterates the fifth commandment that we are to honour our father and mother. And chapter 20 and verse 9, it actually prohibits bringing a curse on your parents as something that is wrong. Now the specifics in how we honour our parents today, that is going to be different to how it was in Old Testament Israel. But the principle still carries over. The principle that we are to honour our parents as the ones who have given us life in the first place. Now, we may have had a very challenging relationship with our parents, or maybe just one of them. And maybe that affects the degree to which we are practically able to honour them. And if that's your situation, there's a lot to wrestle with in that. There is a lot to work through. It's not easy, and it will take a lot of time to think that through. And if it would be helpful, I'm always happy to have a chat with anyone who wants to talk through their own particular situation on this matter or on any other matter, for that matter. But in marriage and in parenting, we are to be holy, to enjoy God's good gifts that he has given us according to his ways. Thirdly, we are to be holy in relation to the community. There's so much here about how we are to relate to each other. What is deemed the second most important command comes up in these chapters, that we are to love our neighbour as ourselves. And I think what this is marked by is two things: justice and mercy. Justice and mercy. And these are two of the core ways that God deals with us. In justice, there needs to be a payment for sin that is made. But in mercy, he recognizes that we cannot pay for it ourselves. And so he pays that cost himself in the giving of his Son. Justice and mercy, in the way God relates to us, are held together. Wonderfully so. And so we are to respond in the way we respond to other people in the community, by justice and mercy. It's mostly in chapter 19 that all of these come up, and for the sake of time, let me just take two examples as examples of the whole. So in relation to mercy, the Israelites had the gleaning law. So farmers, when they had their field, they weren't supposed to harvest to the very edges of their field. They were not supposed to be the most precise farmers. They were supposed to leave the very edges with the crops still there. And that was so that the poor people in the community could come along to the field and help themselves. Gleaning was what it was called. So people in poverty, they weren't just given handouts as such, but they had a means of providing for themselves. The principle carries over. Just as poor people in that society were not abandoned, so for us, when we think through people who are in need in our societies, they should not be abandoned. Even foreigners, even people who weren't part of Israel ethnically, but were living amongst the people of Israel, even they were given rights and were cared for, as the end of chapter 19 goes into. So that's mercy, that we care for those who are in need. What about injustice? Well, you've got verses 35 to 36 of chapter 19. In buying and selling, as they would weigh out the grain, it would be very easy to use weights that are advantageous to the trader, wouldn't it? You know, you put on a weight that makes it look like you're giving them 10 kilograms of wheat, but actually you're just giving them 5. And so you're ripping someone off. It'd be very easy to do that. It was very common in these sorts of cultures. But God's people weren't supposed to do that. They weren't supposed to maximize their profits to the detriment of the person that they were selling to. It's not just to do something like that. So in trading, they were to be honest. So as these specifics no longer apply, you know, who here has a field that they harvest every year? None of us, I think. Maybe you have a fruit tree in your garden or something like that. Does that mean you're supposed to leave some of the fruit on the trees or something like that? Do you know modern farming techniques? They use GPS. And they use GPS so that they can maximize their harvest, so they can make sure they get every inch of the field that has been sown with seed, so they can maximize the harvest. Now, that's not wrong. We can't say that that's wrong just because they didn't do that in the Old Testament. And for traders, well, very few traders use scales anymore. It's just for pick and mix these days, isn't it? So with the kids, shops don't use false scales with a pick and mix for kids. Is that the only application that carries on? No, of course not. Though they shouldn't use false scales, that still applies. But the principles still carry through. The principle of being compassionate and merciful to those who are in need, the principle of making sure we do the right thing should be carried through. So for farmers in maximizing their harvests and their crops, that's not wrong. But there is something about being generous when you have had a bumper crop, whether it is as a farmer or whether it is in your normal salary or in whatever else you might make money from. And what about with trading? Well, we can think about Facebook Marketplace as one example. Are we honest with items that we're selling online? Are we honest when we're trying to buy, not just to get the cheapest possible deal and rip someone off? I love a good deal as much as anyone else, but we've got to be honest and just and fair with people that we're buying and selling from, and in the way that we behave in our workplaces. One really big area that this has come up in the last week is the migrant crisis. It's a very current issue, isn't it? And it's an issue that's incredibly difficult to get right. I'm trying to be apolitical here, so not to come down either side on either political party. And I don't envy any Prime Minister or Home Secretary in trying to get this right. And that's because mercy and justice are overlapped here in ways that it's difficult to do one without getting the other wrong. It's difficult to unravel mercy and justice and get them both right in this example. So trying to show love and compassion to asylum seekers who genuinely are in need and are fleeing very awful situations, that is something as Christians we ought to be fully behind. We ought to care for those who are in need, even those who come from foreign countries, just as they, as Israel, were to care for the foreigners in their midst. But to do that whilst also not allowing people to abuse the system and to do the unjust thing, that is tricky. Now, one thing is for sure, that the gangs who send people across in boats, who are abusing people and putting their lives at danger and killing many of them, quite frankly, that's not good at all. And something needs to be done to stop that. How exactly you stop that, that is not an easy question to answer. As I said, I don't envy anyone in that position. But what we certainly should do as God's people is to pray about that. We should pray for our leaders as they make those decisions, that they get it right. Whenever we have influence in the way those kinds of decisions are made, then that is good for us to use. We should employ that as well. Now, with these matters of justice and mercy, a lot of it goes on at a governmental level. A lot of it happens at levels we can't influence, not too much. But in the way that we live our ordinary lives, we can uphold mercy and justice, can't we? In very ordinary ways. For the business person who has maximized their profits, and making sure that they are generous in giving to those who are in need, whether it's through charities or whether it's direct giving to people who are in need. That could be one way of doing it. It can be as simple as the decisions that you make about fair trade food, that you're making sure you're buying food that makes sure that people who are poor are not being ripped off the other end. It comes down to every area of our lives. Practically speaking, we should be thinking about justice and mercy so that we can then be holy in relation to the community as we love our neighbours as ourselves. Now, as we finish, I want to ask one final question. What do we do when we fail? Because we have failed, haven't we? We know that, and we know that, come next week, we may have realised we failed again. We're going to fail. We're going to get it wrong. In all of these areas, we're going to get it wrong sometimes. So what do we do? What do we do when we've been made holy by Jesus, but now we live in an unholy way? Remember the diagram? Remember where we are? This is how we respond in light of what Jesus has done for us. So if we're living in that part and we realize that we are not living how we ought to be living, what do? Go back up a step. Go back up to the top of the mountain. Go back up for the wonderful view of Jesus having given his life over to death to pay for our sin so that we could be completely forgiven of every single one of our failings, even the failing that we're going to do this week. Jesus has fully paid for it all. Jesus has fully atoned for our sin. Jesus is the one who has made us right with God. Jesus is the one who has declared us to be his holy people. Your holiness primarily depends on what Jesus has done for you. So when you and I behave in unholy ways, go back to that which has made us holy. And then by the power of the Spirit, live according to what you've been made to be. Live holy. Be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy, is what God says to us. Let me pray. Father God, we thank you that in Jesus we are declared holy. He has paid fully for our sin if we trust in him. And thank you that because we have been made holy, we get to live lives that enjoy you. Lives that are lived able to please you because you've made us holy and given your Spirit to us to empower us to live holy lives. Forgive us when we do sin. Help us to keep on coming back to the atonement that was made by Jesus. And help us to think about every area of our lives, how we can best live them as lives that are given over to you, to enjoy you, to experience you, to serve you, to have fellowship with you, to follow you. Amen.